heart of Africa's ancient spiritual traditions, a hidden power thrived, one that bound the gods themselves to the will of priests through sacred pacts, sealed in blood and spoken through forgotten codes. Long before the world knew of temples and grand religions, African priesthoods practiced an art of divine negotiation, where the gods were not distant entities but active participants in the lives of men and women. These priests, some of the most powerful figures in their societies, didn't simply worship the divine, they controlled it, forging pacts with gods that shaped the very fabric of reality. In dark caves and atop sacred hills, African priests would call upon the divine, invoking the gods with chants, symbols, and offerings of blood. These were not mere rituals, they were contracts that bound the gods in promises, agreements that could grant protection, bring prosperity, or shift the forces of nature itself. But these agreements came with a price. The gods demanded respect, devotion, and most often, blood. Through ancient symbols like the Ofo of the Igbo, the Odu of the Yoruba, and the Nsibidi of the Efik, these powerful priesthoods communicated the divine law, crafting agreements that were unbreakable, sealed through the sacred act of sacrifice. Vodun priests, the Dibia of the Igbo people, and the Yoruba Babalawo, all these figures held the key to a forgotten world of spiritual power, their rites hidden from most of the world for centuries. They used their knowledge of these spiritual codes to unlock forces beyond human comprehension, creating pacts with gods that still resonate in African spirituality today. The mysteries of these pacts, these divine contracts, have remained shrouded in secrecy, waiting to be rediscovered. And today, we will uncover them. We will step into the shadowed realms where blood was spilled and symbols were etched, where the divine was not just worshipped, but bound to the very lives of the people who knew how to call it into being. In the vast expanse of Africa's spiritual landscape, there existed priesthoods whose influence over both the living and the divine was unmatched. These were not merely spiritual guides, priests who offered prayers or rituals to the gods. They were the mediators of divine power itself, wielding the authority to call upon and bind gods to earthly promises. The Vodun priests of West Africa, the Igbo Dibia, and the Yoruba Babalawo were the guardians of ancient spiritual knowledge, and their roles transcended the everyday practices of faith. These priests held the keys to immense power, wielding a profound responsibility. They were the agents who held the threads between the seen and unseen worlds, stitching together the fabric of reality with divine force. The Vodun priests, also known as the practitioners of Vodou or Voodoo, were an ancient spiritual order from the regions that would become Togo, Benin, and parts of Ghana. Their influence spread far beyond the confines of Africa, especially during the transatlantic slave trade, but their origins lie deeply rooted in the sacred groves and hidden temples of West Africa. The Vodun priesthood was one that was intimately connected to the spirits called Loa, who could shape the course of human life. The Vodun priest's role was not simply one of petitioning the gods for favor. They were the gatekeepers, the ones who negotiated pacts between the mortal realm and the divine. They forged covenants with the Loa, calling them through ritual sacrifices, chants, and dances that reached the gods directly. These pacts could bring protection to the community, healing to the sick, or even prosperity to the land. But they also carried great weight, for to break these divine agreements could bring down the wrath of the very spirits the priests had called into being. Similarly, in Nigeria, the Igbo people's Dibia were spiritual agents of immense power. Unlike priests of other faiths who acted as mediators, the Dibia were trained in the sacred art of divination and had the rare ability to see beyond the physical world. They were not just keepers of sacred knowledge, but wielders of it. The Dibia's role was often to bridge the gap between human concerns and the gods, mediating on matters of life, death, and everything in between. But their power extended far beyond just interpreting the will of the gods. The Dibia had the ability to make pacts with the divine, binding gods to promises that could change the fate of individual or entire communities. These pacts could be formed through the use of sacred objects like the ofo, a symbol of divine authority that could bind a person to an agreement or bring a curse if violated. The Dibia were seen as the final authority on matters of life and death, their knowledge of the spiritual world making them both revered and feared. The Yoruba Babalawo, another powerful priesthood in West Africa, particularly in the Yoruba regions of Nigeria, were also central to African spiritual practices. The Babalawo, who served as diviners, healers, and spiritual leaders, held dominion over the sacred knowledge of Ifa, a system of divination that could access the wisdom of the gods themselves. The Babalawo's primary tool was the Odu Ifa, a set of sacred verses believed to contain the wisdom of the universe. Through the Odu, the Babalawo could communicate with the gods and draw up pacts that could influence everything from an individual's fate to the well-being of a nation. Unlike the Western conception of a singular god, the Yoruba belief system is deeply polytheistic, and the gods known as Orisha were deeply intertwined with the forces of nature. The Babalawo's role was not simply to ask for divine favors, but to enter into mutual agreements with the Orisha, guiding humanity in a way that aligned with cosmic law and divine will. The pacts they formed were not only about invoking divine power, but also about maintaining balance and harmony between the spiritual and physical worlds. In each of these priesthoods, the power these individuals held was not taken lightly. These were not mere religious figures. They were guardians of the cosmic balance, wielding immense responsibility. To invoke a god was not simply to request favor, but to align with the very forces that governed life itself. The Vodun priests, Igbo Dibia and Yoruba Babalawo, were responsible for keeping the spiritual order intact. Their agreements with the divine were made with deep respect and careful negotiation, and breaking these agreements could have catastrophic consequences, not only for the individual but for entire communities. The gods did not simply grant favors, they were bound by these agreements, and the priests acted as both the architects and enforcers of these divine laws. The weight of responsibility that came with being a priest in these spiritual systems cannot be overstated. The relationship between the priest and the divine was not one of submission, but of power sharing, an agreement, an exchange, a mutual bond. These priesthoods understood that the gods could not be forced into service, but rather invited into a relationship based on trust, respect, and balance. They carried the heavy responsibility of ensuring that these relationships were honored, both on the spiritual and the earthly plane, a role that made them both respected and feared in their communities. The power of these priests, then, was not just in their ability to call upon the divine, but in their capacity to navigate and maintain the delicate balance of the universe itself. In the intricate web of African spirituality, there was no such thing as a mere prayer or a passing request. When the ancient priests called upon the gods, they did so through a series of sacred codes and symbols, spiritual languages that transcended mere words and entered the realm of power. These codes were not just abstract beliefs or mystical musings. They were the foundation of divine contracts. They served as the legal language of the divine, ensuring that the pacts made between humans and gods were not only understood, but binding and enforceable. Three of the most powerful spiritual codes used by African priests to bind the gods were the Ofo, the Odu, and Nsibidi. Each of these codes had profound significance and was deeply interwoven with the culture, beliefs, and rituals of the people who used them. The ofo is perhaps one of the most sacred symbols in the Igbo spiritual system. It is a staff or object imbued with the authority of the divine, representing the power to speak truth, enforce justice, and bind the will of the gods. The ofo is both a physical object and a spiritual force, carrying with it the energy of divine law and cosmic order. When the Dibia, the Igbo spiritual leaders, invoked the gods or entered into a divine agreement, they did so using the ofo as a symbol of their authority. The object itself was considered to hold the power of divine truth, and through its use, the Dibia could ensure that any pact made was grounded in the highest form of justice. Whether it was used to call upon an ancestral spirit or to seal a promise with a god, the ofo acted as a spiritual guarantor of the agreement, ensuring that both parties, human and divine, would be held to their end of the bargain. The ofo represented balance, a balance between humanity and the gods, and a balance between life and death. Its power lay in its ability to ensure that the terms of any spiritual contract were honored, thus maintaining harmony between the two worlds. The Odu, used by the Yoruba Babalawo in their system of divination known as Ifa, is another critical spiritual code that helped bind the gods. The Odu is a collection of sacred verses, each one holding the wisdom and commands of the gods. These verses are the core of Ifa, and when a Babalawo performs a divination, they are interpreting the will of the gods as it is expressed through the Odu. But the Odu is more than just a collection of divine knowledge. It is a tool used to forge pacts. The Odu contains not only wisdom, but also the authority to enact change. When the Babalawo performed a ritual to invoke the gods, they would often use specific Odu verses to ask for protection, guidance, or intervention. These verses were part of a sacred dialogue with the divine, and the gods were bound by the wisdom of the Odu to fulfill the terms of the agreement. Just as the ofo in Igbo culture ensured divine justice, the Odu ensured that the will of the gods would manifest in the world according to the spiritual codes laid out in the sacred verses. Then there is NCBD, a system of ideographic writing used by the Efik, Ibibio, and other southeastern Nigerian groups. While the ofo and the Odu are symbolic and oral in nature, NCBD represents a visual language, one that could encode spiritual meanings, instructions, and contracts in symbols. Unlike alphabetic writing systems, NCBD was a collection of symbols that were designed to convey complex ideas, rituals, and agreements. It was used in the context of spiritual and secret societies, where knowledge was passed down in symbols that were known only to initiated members. The use of NCBD in sacred pacts allowed for a deeper level of secrecy and protection, ensuring that divine contracts remained inviolable and secure from those not initiated into the sacred mysteries. Whether etched onto ritual objects, painted on sacred walls, or drawn in the sand, NCBD allowed for the transmission of divine will in a form that was both permanent and powerful. The very act of inscribing these symbols was an invocation of the gods, binding the spiritual forces to the physical world in a way that words alone could not achieve. These spiritual codes, ofo, Odu, and NCBD, were not merely decorative or symbolic. They were the very mechanisms by which African priests bound the gods to their word. When a pact was made using these codes, it was not a casual promise. It was a sacred agreement, sealed in divine law. The gods were bound to honor their side of the deal, just as the people were bound to uphold their part of the contract. These symbols and sacred objects were the keys to ensuring that the terms of divine agreements were followed. Without them, the pacts would lack authority and power, and the delicate balance between the gods and the people could be disturbed. The use of these codes was essential in maintaining balance in African spiritual systems. They ensured that the spiritual world did not remain a distant, untouchable realm, but was interwoven with the practical, everyday realities of life, The gods were not abstract, unreachable entities. They were living forces, constantly interacting with and affecting the lives of the people. By using sacred codes like the Ofo, Odu, and Nsibidi, the priests were able to maintain harmony between the spiritual and physical realms. These codes helped establish a mutual respect between humanity and the divine, with each side bound to its responsibilities. When a pact was made using these spiritual symbols, it was not only an agreement between the gods and the priests, it was a covenant that held the power to shape the course of history, ensuring that the gods would intervene in the lives of humans in a way that was just, balanced, and harmonious. In this way, the codes served as the spiritual glue that held together the cosmos itself.
Blood has long been a symbol of life, vitality, and power in African spirituality. It is not merely a fluid coursing through the veins, but a potent symbol of life itself, holding the essence of existence and the forces that govern it. In African spiritual traditions, blood is sacred, imbued with the power to create, to destroy, to bind, and to heal. When priests and practitioners invoked the gods, blood was often the medium through which the divine and the earthly worlds were connected. It was the offering that sealed the contract, the ultimate symbol of the seriousness of the pact being made. The use of blood in these rituals wasn't about cruelty or sacrifice for its own sake. It was a deeply spiritual act that acknowledged the sacredness of the agreement being forged. Blood was the life force that bridged the gap between the human and the divine, an offering of the highest value to ensure that the gods would honor their word. In Vodun, for example, blood is a central element in many of the rituals that the priests perform to call upon the lower, the spirits that serve as intermediaries between the human world and the gods. Vodun priests, known as Hongans or Mambos, use blood as a form of spiritual currency in exchange for favor such as protection, healing, or prosperity. The lower demand offerings of blood, often from animals, which are seen as conduits between the human and spiritual realms. The ritual sacrifices performed in Vodun are not seen as acts of violence, but as acts of respect, offering life to the divine in order to maintain the cosmic balance. The offering of blood acknowledges the relationship between the priest, the people, and the divine, creating a reciprocal bond. When the lower accept the offering of blood, they are bound to fulfill their promises, and the spiritual equilibrium is maintained. Similarly, in Yoruba tradition, blood plays a central role in the rituals performed by the Babalawo and other practitioners of Ifa. The Yoruba believe that the Orisha, the gods that govern the forces of nature, can only be properly appeased through offerings that include blood. These sacrifices often involve the slaughter of animals, particularly goats or chickens, whose blood is spilled to honor the gods and to ensure their protection and favor. The blood offered is believed to carry the essence of life, and in return the Orisha are bound to fulfill their part of the spiritual agreement. In Yoruba spirituality, blood isn't just a substance. It is the essence of divine law. It is through blood that the priest affirms the pact with the gods, ensuring that the divine powers are engaged and bound by the terms set out during the ritual. The Igbo people, too, place great significance on blood in their spiritual practices. The Dibia, the Igbo spiritual leaders, use blood in divination rituals, sacrifices, and offerings. One of the most sacred practices among the Igbo involves the use of the Ofo, a sacred object that represents divine truth and justice. When making pacts with the gods, the Dibaya often offer blood to ensure that the terms of the agreement are honored. This can be the blood of an animal or, in some rare cases, the priest's own blood, offered as a symbol of deep commitment to the divine cause. The spilling of blood in Igbo spirituality is not just for the gods. It is an offering to ancestors as well, creating a powerful connection between the living and the spiritual realms. The blood is seen as a vital force, a link that ties human existence to the divine, ensuring that the gods and ancestors will intervene in human affairs with justice and favor. In all of these traditions, the use of blood is an acknowledgement of the sacredness of life and the power it holds. To offer blood in these rituals is to offer the very essence of existence to the gods in exchange for their blessings, their protection, or their intervention. Blood is a sacred medium that reinforces the binding power of the pact. Without blood, the agreement would lack the gravity necessary for divine intervention. Blood is both the payment and the seal, the substance that enforces the contract. It is a potent reminder that these pacts are not casual. They are sacred exchanges that carry weight and responsibility on both sides. The gods are bound by blood, and the people are equally bound to honor the terms of the agreement. For to break such a pact is to risk the wrath of the divine forces. The sacredness of blood and the responsibility it carries in these spiritual agreements cannot be overstated. Blood is not simply a commodity to be traded, it is life itself. And to offer it is to acknowledge the deep connection between humanity and the divine. The gods, through their power and influence, are bound by the offerings of blood, just as the people are bound to live in accordance with the divine laws that govern their world.
The use of blood in the spiritual agreements ensures that both sides are equally committed, creating a profound bond between the mortal and the immortal. In the end, the offering of blood is both an act of reverence and a statement of power, a way of binding the gods to the promises made and ensuring that the sacred pacts forged through ritual will be honored for generations to come. In the ancient African spiritual systems, breaking a pact with the gods was not a trivial matter. The very fabric of life was woven together through sacred agreements, and these pacts, often sealed with blood and spiritual codes, carried profound consequences. In African traditions, divine pacts were seen as binding not just on paper or in words, but within the very laws of nature and the universe. The gods were not abstract figures. They were real forces that governed everything from the seasons to the fate of individuals. When a pact was broken, it was seen as an affront not only to the divine but to the natural order itself. This was a violation that reverberated across the spiritual and physical realms, bringing with it a retribution that was swift, severe, and often devastating. African priests, as intermediaries between the divine and the human, took the responsibility of ensuring that the terms of these pacts were honored. They were not just spiritual leaders, but the enforcers of cosmic law, holding the sacred knowledge that allowed them to guide their communities in their relationships with the gods. These priests understood the gravity of the agreements they made, and they used their knowledge of rituals, symbols, and sacrifices to ensure that both the gods and the people remained true to their word. When the terms of a pact were violated, the priests had the power to invoke divine retribution. This wasn't just a matter of personal betrayal. It was a breach of spiritual law, with consequences that could affect entire communities. One of the most common forms of divine retribution for a broken pact was the unleashing of natural disasters. In Vodun, for example, the gods or lower were seen as forces that controlled the elements: rain, wind, fire, and the earth itself. When a person or a community violated a pact made with the lower, the gods could unleash devastating storms, floods, or droughts. These natural disasters were not just random events. They were seen as messages from the divine, a sign that the balance had been disrupted. A broken pact in this context was seen as a personal affront to the gods, and the resulting disaster was both punishment and a means of restoring the cosmic order. It was a reminder to the community that the divine could intervene in the natural world when necessary to restore balance. In Yoruba tradition, broken pacts with the Orisha, the gods who govern the forces of nature, could lead to similar forms of divine wrath. If a person broke their oath or violated the terms of a spiritual agreement, they could be struck by illness, misfortune, or even death. The Orisha were seen as powerful beings who controlled various aspects of life: wealth, health, fertility, and protection. To break a pact with an Orisha was to bring upon oneself their disfavor, which could manifest in the form of disease, accidents, or personal failure. One of the most severe consequences was that of being cut off from the divine favor of the Orisha, leaving the person vulnerable to the forces of chaos and misfortune. The Yoruba believed that the Orisha could withdraw the blessings, leaving individuals and communities to face the destructive forces of imbalance. In Igbo culture, the consequences of broken pacts were often seen as spiritual curses that affected not only the individual, but their entire lineage. The Ofo, a sacred symbol representing truth, justice, and divine authority, was used to seal agreements with the gods. If a person violated the terms of an agreement, they risked incurring the wrath of both the gods and their ancestors. The Igbo believed that the gods and ancestors were watching over their descendants, and breaking a pact could result in curses that affected not just the individual, but the family and descendants for generations. These curses could manifest in various forms: poor harvests, infertility, constant misfortune, or early death. The Igbo believed that honoring the gods and ancestors was not only a personal duty, but a responsibility to the community and future generations. Breaking a pact was seen as a failure to uphold the sacred bond that connected the living to the divine and the ancestral spirits. The importance of honor, balance, and respect in these spiritual agreements cannot be overstated. African spirituality is deeply rooted in the idea that all things are interconnected. Humans, gods, nature, and ancestors are all part of the same cosmic order. This interconnectedness means that when one part of the system is disrupted, the entire balance is threatened. The gods, as powerful beings who governed these forces, were not to be taken lightly. They were not vengeful entities, but forces that maintained order and justice in the universe. To break a pact was to disrupt this order, and the consequences were not just punitive but corrective, intended to restore balance and harmony to the world. The priests who mediated these agreements understood the delicate balance of the universe and worked tirelessly to ensure that the terms of divine pacts were followed. They knew that the gods could be merciful, but they could also be fierce when provoked. When an individual or a community broke their word, the gods were quick to act, not out of spite, but to restore the balance that had been disrupted. The punishment for broken pacts was a reflection of the sacredness of the agreement itself, because to violate a divine contract was to risk the collapse of the very order that held the world together. This understanding of balance and respect was central to African spiritual traditions, where the relationship between the gods and humanity was one of mutual respect, responsibility, and ultimately accountability. In the world of ancient African spirituality, the bonds between humans and the divine were not just symbolic or abstract. They were real, tangible, and enforced with consequences that spanned beyond the spiritual realm into the physical world. The pacts forged by the Vodun priests, the Igbo Dibia, and the Yoruba Babalawo were powerful agreements sealed with blood, sacred codes, and divine oaths. These were not casual promises. They were contracts that bound the gods to the lives of the people, ensuring balance, prosperity, protection, and divine intervention. But with such power came immense responsibility. These pacts were not to be broken lightly, for the consequences of betrayal were severe. From natural disasters to illness, from curses to death, the gods enforced their contracts with unwavering authority, restoring balance whenever it was disturbed. These divine retributions were not out of malice. They were meant to preserve the sacred order of the universe, an order in which respect for the gods and the maintenance of balance were paramount. The sacredness of blood, the role of spiritual codes, and the divine retribution for broken pacts all reveal a deep understanding of cosmic harmony. In African spirituality, the gods were not distant entities removed from the affairs of humanity. They were intimately connected to the lives of the people, and their influence could be invoked, respected, or feared. The priests who mediated these pacts held the power to shape destinies, calling upon the gods to fulfill promises made and ensuring that both the divine and human sides honored their sacred agreements. As we look back on these traditions, we realize that they were not just about spiritual power. They were about the intricate sacred dance between humanity and the divine, a dance in which both sides were accountable to one another. To break a pact with the gods was to risk the very fabric of existence. And this understanding of responsibility, honor, and balance is something that continues to echo in African spiritual practices today. The story of these ancient pacts serves as a reminder of the deep, unbreakable ties that connect us to the divine and the consequences of disrupting that sacred bond.